Morning, everybody. We'll get started here in a minute, as soon as the clock strikes 10. All right. Good morning, everybody. This is a special open meeting of the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission on Tuesday, September 2nd, and it is 10 a.m. And we are gathered virtually today to talk about one of our workshop series having to do with grid readiness and economic development. So we'll go ahead and do a roll call. Ms. Stephans, if you can please do the honor.
Good morning, Chair, Commissioners. Commissioner O'Connell,
Here.
Commissioner Nybert,
Present.
Commissioner Aguilera.
Present.
We have all three commissioners present and we have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. So we have a item next on our agenda, consideration and approval of the agenda. I noticed that there was no kind of room on here for us to make any introductory remarks, so I was thinking maybe we could make some introductory remarks after the public comment. And I don't know that we need to formally amend the agenda, but I think after public comment, just wanted to I had a few things I want to share, and you might as well, commissioners. But aside from that, are there any suggested changes or recommendations? And again, I wasn't planning to move to amend the agenda. I think we can just call on each other.
I have no changes.
Okay. Well, then I would move to approve the agenda for today's meeting as posted.
I'll second the motion.
Great. And then we could just do a voice vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay. And none opposed. So I did also want to check here, Commissioner O'Connell, we didn't talk about the logistics. I wanted to, just check to see if you wanted to lead the next portion of the meeting. I'm prepared to do so if not, but you know, you've been
No, thank you for that. And I'd say since you are prepared, you should do it.
all right. Sounds good. All right. As next matter of business, here we have opportunity for public comment. And so I'll look to Mr. Rodriguez to help manage that. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do have one individual signed up for public comment. Anna Linden, are you there?
I hope I am. Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. Chair Aguilera, Commissioner Nybert, Commissioner O'Connell. My name is Anna Linden Weller. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for Clean Energy at Western Resource Advocates. Thanks for the opportunity to give public comment. Over the past few years, 7 of the 8 largest utilities in the interior West, located in Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah. These are the places where my organization works to decarbonize the power sector. We've seen collective load forecasts increase significantly, largely due to the projected electricity demands of data centers. This is as much as 4.5% per year between 2025 and 2035. That's for annual energy demand, and a similar trend is true for peak energy demands, and this exacerbates stress on the grid. WRA has published an extensive report on data center impacts in the West, which is available on our website and which I will provide to the Commission staff in addition so that you can all have it. Our report gives detailed policy recommendations to utility commissions that we believe will help data center growth be more beneficial to the grid while minimizing greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to very briefly highlight some of those recommendations that you can read more about. First, the Commission could create a clean transition tariff. Transition tariffs enable new data center customers to develop and finance clean energy resources like solar with battery storage and wind. Under a clean transition tariff, a utility may develop new clean resources on behalf of its data center customers, and the data center will pay any incremental additional cost of the clean resource without impacting other customers. This is similar to the tariff for the 36B customer that already exists in New Mexico. Our second recommendation, the Commission could incentivize data centers that are going to take advantage of the new microgrid provision in HB 93 to deploy behind-the-meter clean resources. With behind-the-meter resources, the data center can develop, own, and operate the clean energy directly. Data centers should be limited to deploying clean resources and not behind-the-meter gas or diesel generators which emit greenhouse gas pollution and degrade local air quality. Thirdly, the Commission should encourage load shifting and participation in demand response programs, possibly as a condition of approving new data center tariffs or special service contracts. Shifting data centers are generally very high load factor customers. Their demand for electricity is relatively constant from hour to hour, day to day. However, certain types of data centers may be able to participate in demand response programs, shifting their electricity consumption away from times of peak demand and reducing the strain on the broader grid. You can encourage your utilities to craft load interconnection standards or tariffs or provisions that allow for interruption, in exchange perhaps for faster interconnection. And most importantly, the Commission should protect existing electricity customers. The explosion of data center electricity needs injects massive uncertainty into utilities' near and long-term growth projections in a very short period of time. And this we have seen is straining their ability to forecast future system needs accurately. If utilities end up overbuilding transmission, generation, or distribution infrastructure, then residential and commercial customers that already exist could be left on the hook, forced to pay for these capital investments that turn out to be unnecessary. To improve load forecasts, the Commission could consider establishing best practices and requirements for utility load forecasting. And it's also critical that utilities develop robust contract provisions for data centers that will protect other customers from having to subsidize them. These provisions could include things like minimum contract lengths, exit penalties, financial collateral requirements, and minimum demand payments. The Commission should also consider revamping the integrated resource planning process to better accommodate the rapid and uncertain nature of data center growth, as we and many others, including some of our utilities, suggested in our responses to your second bench request in this docket earlier this year. There's many other recommendations and more details in our report. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give public comment.
Thank you for your comment. Mr. Rodriguez, do we have anybody else?
Mr. Chair, that's it for public comment.
Okay. Thank you for those comments. I wanted to take a quick note before we go to our presenters. Looking over the materials that our presenters have authored different papers. Next, we're going to have Miss Natalie Mims-Frick from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs present, and her paper noted that, and I'll paraphrase, but something to the effect that regulators, utilities, and large customer loads are exploring tariffs and rate structures and service agreements, special contracts that achieve the objectives of reliable and affordable power and mitigate financial risk to ratepayers. And that resonates. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but it is what we're trying to do here. And so I appreciate the public comment and the information that we've had submitted into the record as well. As I think about what we are trying to accomplish here, for me, it's a lot about a, a fair allocation of costs to ratepayers, um, and a fair opportunity for large customers to interconnect and start receiving power from the utility. And I wonder whether having standardized rules can facilitate that. A standardized tariff, not necessarily a rule, but a tariff, will it make it easier for a large customer to know what to expect? In the past, we've talked a lot about regulatory certainty, and I think that's, what this industry thrives on. And so if we have tariff that is applicable to large customers, um, that reflects the needs of today's large customers. Is that something that we should undertake? We have a special contract and have some experience with that. Is that the path we want to go forward? And so this is, I think, a good conversation for us to have. And I'm really looking forward to learning from our presenters today. So I want to turn it over to maybe Commissioner O'Connell first and then Nybert to see if you have any remarks.
Yeah, thank you for that. As was noted, this is one installment of a series of workshops that we set off and to do. And if, the caption for this series is about grid readiness and economic development. So that encompasses more than just data centers. So just want to put it in that context. And then the other thing is, as commissioners can attest, data centers are a big topic. I think they're a big topic because of the challenges we're going to hear about today. And on balance, the need for data centers is real, and having them in the United States is valuable. So it's a problem that's worth solving, I think, in terms of the concept of public interest. So appreciate everybody that's here today that's going to provide information. Also, having spent months working on this with Erica Stefans, these workshops have helped clarify and scope out some things that we have done and can do in the future with respect to the topic. So they've been valuable, expecting a lot of value today. And so again, thank you to all who are here and especially the presenters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just add that we appreciate everyone being here today and participating. Look forward to the information that's going to be provided. We have to get it right. As a state, as a nation, we have to get it right. And the tremendous increase in projected demand is a challenge not only in New Mexico but nationwide, and so we're here willing to learn, try to figure out how to best address the issues, and hopefully New Mexico will be a place where we can capitalize on some of the large centers that are being proposed. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we can get down to business, and our first presenter today is Miss Natalie Mims-Frick from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, and she will discuss a paper that she co-authored. And so I'll turn it over to you, Miss Frick. Mims-Frick, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to ask for timing. Should I wrap up by 10:30 still, or do you want me to talk for 20 minutes? What's everyone's preference on when I'm
I
done, because I'll
right,
go on for a very long time.
I noticed that we did not leave any room for introductions, and I think probably 20 minutes would be too probably too short. I would say take your 30 minutes. We're
Okay,
here to listen, so thank you.
awesome. I will try and focus my content on the comments that have been made thus far as well. So we can go on to the next slide. Um, my agenda for what I have today, I wanted to talk quickly about load growth, and then I wanted to talk about, what is a tariff? Tariffs mean lots of things to everyone right now in this current time and space, but we're talking about electricity tariffs. And then how can they be used in an era of rapid load growth? And then I wanted to go through some themes of tariffs that we found from a review that we did. And then I was going to focus in a little bit on demand flexibility, which is primarily interruptible service tariffs. And then I was going to spend just a very small amount of time talking about special contracts because I know one of your other speakers is going to talk about that at the end of the session. What is it and how have they historically been used? And how can they be used in an era of rapid load growth? And then I have a couple of slides on resources just so that, if you want to look back at any of this, it's easily available. So we can go on to the next slide and we can probably skip that one because I think oh, nope, here we go, load growth. So this slide on the left shows load growth estimates from EPRI, and they have up to 15% annual growth rate for data centers specifically that they're projecting out could be within the range of what may happen by 2030. And then on the right side of the slide is a report from Berkeley Lab. It was a congressional report on data center electricity use. And the approach that they used for that one was looking at counts of servers and storage and network equipment and infrastructure and rolling that up to what their energy estimate is, which is why it's a little bit shorter term, slightly lower. But this is all to say there's lots and lots of estimates out there about how much load growth is going to happen from data centers and from other large loads. And I think we're all aware of that. And that was just kind of my foundation of where we're starting. We can go on to the next slide. And this is 4 charts that summarize data center growth. And so from the bottom left, this one's focused on the percentage of time servers are operational. And this is starting to increase, and it's increasing with different types of computing that are happening. So we're getting up to 80%, uh, potentially 80% with some of the AI applications. And this is important because we're talking about data centers using the maximum amount of capacity that they've been requesting from the utility. So then if we go up to the top left, what we see is that graphics processing units or GPUs are using more energy than other server types, in particular for AI. And AI is also the data type that is increasing their server utilization rates. And then if we go over to the top left, you can see, or excuse me, the top right, the number of installed AI services is growing significantly. And those higher energy intensity servers are expected to grow more quickly in the future as well. And then the bottom right adds everything up, and that's kind of part of how we got to what this projection was. And so, it's increasing utilization, increasing amount of electricity for AI, and then increased amounts of AI in general is rolling up to why we're at this kind of big data center conversation. And we can go on to the next slide. And I think this speaks a little bit to what one of the commissioners was saying earlier is that, it's not just data centers that are creating load growth. There's lots of other sources of load growth as well. It's data centers, it's manufacturing, it's onshoring of manufacturing, building, and electrical vehicle and vehicle electrification are also aspects of why we have load growth. And it's important to understand those in order to appropriately plan. Your load shape is what's shown on these 4 different slides. This is from the Pacific Northwest. It's looking at a regional and then regional multi-state and then utility level looks at what their load growth is coming from. And you can see the shapes are quite different depending on what's driving it. If it's residential and electrification, you're in the bottom left corner. There's a significantly different shape than if you're over on the bottom right where it's residential population growth and then data centers as well. And so understanding that is important as you think about how you're going to deal with your large load growth. We can go on to the next slide. So this is, we can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about the paper that we released in January that focuses on large load tariffs. We reviewed 11 different tariffs. Brattle helped us out with this. The Department of Energy funded it and also helped us do some of the research. And in our review of these 11 different tariffs, and there's many more that have been released since then, we identified 4 different themes. And those are what we'll use to illustrate what tariffs are. And before we get into that, I just kind of wanted to do this level setting. What is a tariff? It's a structure of utility rates and services, and there are rules for specific utility services, and those are approved by commissions. So that's what we're talking about when we say tariff. And we can go on to the next slide. There has been rapid growth in the large load tariff design space. There was 11 that we reviewed in January, and then I think since then probably another 11 have been proposed. Historically, tariffs have been used to recover embedded costs, and large load tariffs are being proposed address a variety of different concerns. They're being proposed to address cost shifting, risk of stranded assets. They're being proposed to provide options for large load customers, and also to create a streamlined approach. And the utilities and the regulators may also have objectives that they're trying to achieve as they are designing and proposing these tariffs. And those could be around resource adequacy or air pollutant emissions reductions. Affordability is top of mind for everyone right now. And also desire to attract large load customers, through economic development. And so some of these are, there's tension between achieving all of these objectives, but we have some examples where people are doing the best they can with that. So we can go on to the next slide. So I have 2 slides on eligibility, and then I'm going to get into the 4 themes. So in terms of what customers are eligible for tariffs, what we've been seeing is a lot of them have a minimum size requirement, and this varies very largely. It can be between 10 megawatts to 500 megawatts, depending on what the different utility is trying to achieve and what their customer base looks like. Voltage service is also something that we've been seeing coming up in tariff eligibility. It could be focused on transmission only, or we could be talking about primary and secondary services as well. And those are being explicitly listed in tariffs now as well as part of the eligibility criteria. So we go on to the next slide. Another aspect of eligibility is around the load factor, and some utilities are proposing minimum load factors as part of their eligibility criteria. And I just wanted to note that requiring minimum load factors is not the same as the utilization rate. And I talked about this at the beginning with the load growth. This is the same graphic that shows the different utilization or percentage of time that the server's operational. If you are operating at 70% of your capacity that you've contracted for, and you have, a very flat load factor, not peaky, you're still only operating at 70% of your contracted capacity. And so understanding the difference between the utilization rate of how much energy your data centers are consuming, your large loads are consuming, and what their load factor is very important, because if you have excess energy in your system that you could be using for something else, it's nice to know that so that we can use it, most appropriately at its highest use for everybody that needs it. So we can go on to the next slide, and I'll talk about those 4 themes. And the first one is around mitigating utility and ratepayer financial risks. And there's 4 different aspects that we saw in the tariffs that we were looking at. The first one is around minimum load requirements, both for eligibility, but also for minimum bills and minimum demand charges. And this is showing up as kind of a take or pay contract, where regardless of if you're using the total amount of capacity that you've requested, you're going to pay for it, or you're going to pay for some percentage of it. In terms of upfront payment and exit fees, some tariffs are requiring that costs, such as those associated with upgrades to be funded by large load customers, be tied to a deposit or contribution in aid of construction, and that's to limit your stranded assets. There's also exit fee requirements. So if you leave your contract early, you're going to pay for 36, 48 months of what your service would have been while the utility can prepare for what they will do with the excess capacity that they now have in your system, since as a large customer you've left. Another thing that we saw in the tariffs is credit ratings and collateral requirements. This, varied quite a bit, but depending on the credit rating that the entity requesting service had. It dictated for some of the tariffs how much collateral was required and how that collateral could be held. And then one of the other approaches that we saw to mitigate risk is creating longer term contracts. And this is looking beyond a 5-year contract, looking at a 10-year contract. Some proposed tariffs have for the life of the service of the infrastructure, which is a very long tariff at that point, or a very long contract at that point. So a pretty wide range, but most tariffs we're looking at are having a minimum contract duration in order to protect customers and also the utility from stranded assets. We can go on to the next slide. This is around the second theme, which is fair cost allocation, which is very important. There's 3 different elements that we found in this one. The first one is applying the tariff to specific customers to help mitigate cost shifting. To avoid discriminatory rates, we're generally seeing that these tariffs are showing up as large load tariffs and not data center tariffs, or just generally describing the characteristics of the load, high variable load growth, et cetera. Another element is using marginal pricing to identify the cost of bringing the next unit of energy online and assigning costs to those customers to limit cross subsidization and ensure that your new generation or grid infrastructure are being appropriately attributed to customers within their class and customers in general. And then the last one is that we saw around cost allocation is economic development tariffs to attract business to come in. And we saw a few different approaches that have been used. A lot of the time, we're seeing the economic development aspect of this in legislation, and then it's being referenced in tariffs, where if you take this action, then you have access to the economic development payments. There's also language around double counting. You can't get economic development payments from 2 different buckets. So looking at ways to make sure that people are able to take those economic development credits, but not taking advantage of them. We can go on to the next slide. This is my third theme, I think, which is on mitigating operational and resource adequacy risks. So I think that people are probably all aware of this. Last summer, there was grid operators in Northern Virginia that had 60 data centers that were using like 1,500 megawatts of power that simultaneously dropped offline. And this, I think, really elevated the conversation around resource adequacy and operational concerns. And so these are some of the tariffs that we've been seeing in that. The minimum load factor, I talked about that earlier on, trying to reduce the peakiness of what the load is that's being served. Ramp times, and these are being referenced in tariffs both so customers can slowly start to consume capacity that's available to them, but also allowing them to build up their facility over time, as well as allowing the utility to offer additional capacity as it becomes available as they're building it. So there's a variety of different reasons that we're seeing these ramp rates, but for the most part, almost all of the tariffs have some kind of ramping schedule in them, at the end of which the load needs to be taking all of its service. And then behind the meter resources. And some of the tariffs that we're seeing, they're allowing behind the meter resources to provide backup power. Sometimes the tariffs explicitly are saying that the behind the meter resources cannot be used to reduce the contracted capacity amount that is needed. Sometimes they are allowed. So it depends on what the state's looking for and how the utility feels about that backup generation, and if the utility is able to control any of that backup generation as well. We can go on to my next slide. And this one is around elements to meet the needs of the large load customers that are interested. And for the most part, this is around clean energy requirements and opportunities to advance specific types of technologies within states. And the very big example of this was the clean transition tariff. We heard about it earlier in the public comment, and I believe that our next speaker is also going to be talking about this, so I won't focus on it too much. But if we go on to the next slide, I'm just going to dig in a little bit deeper on demand flexibility offerings. This is something that's been a very hot topic lately. There's not a lot of really great examples, but we can go on to the next slide. This is a map from EPRI's DC Flex initiative, which is Data Center Flex, and they're focused on looking at identifying opportunities working with utilities to figure out how data centers can be flexible. And this is a map that shows flexible tariffs. And as you can see, the majority of the country has offerings for industrial flexibility, and for the most part, they're interruptible service tariffs. And those can be applicable to large loads depending on what your large load is, but they might not be sufficient as we're thinking through what large loads need for flexibility. We can go on to the next slide. I have just a few examples. Idaho Power has their speculative high density load. That's really a crypto tariff that they designed where they can remotely disconnect their customers for 225 hours annually. And in their tariff, they give parameters around the timing of that. Entergy in Arkansas has their large power, high load density. The interruptions will range based on the curtailment notice time that's being offered. In Montana Dakota Utility, they have their high density contracted demand response that allows service to be interrupted for 200 hours as part of the electric service agreement that's agreed upon. And then in Ohio Power, their data center tariff that was approved in July requires customers that have behind the meter generation to be capable of instantly curtailing the quantity of load that they have that's available. That's the same or equal to what their behind the meter generation is, to make sure that if their behind the meter generation doesn't show up, they're not causing any problems on the system. We go to the next slide. I have just two more examples on this. One is from Xcel Energy in Colorado, and this is I think this is Colorado, not Minnesota. Their proposed large general time of day service, which is going to be a 2-period time of day schedule. And I haven't seen too many examples of this, but in addition to their general time of day service, they also have interruptible service options, as well as the opportunity for the customers, large load customers, to participate in demand response programs that they already have available, depending again on the type of load that it is. And then my last example here is from Black Hill Power, and that's their economic flexible load service. And that utility is the requirements around that is that the utility can interrupt customers at their discretion. So it's a little bit of a vaguer tariff that they're offering there. If we go on to my next slide, this was mentioned in public comment as well at the beginning of our call. Demand flexibility can also be included as part of a requirement for interconnection, meaning if you interconnect, we'll interconnect X amount of power for you. You have to drop your load when our system gets stressed. This could be an opportunity to bring load online faster if that's agreeable to everyone. I have a couple of examples here. California, this is really an electrification, a vehicle electrification pilot program that they're looking at that offers limited interconnection in return for flexibility during peak times. And then Texas SB6 is a very talked about topic as of late. It requires that before loads are interconnected, there has to be remote disconnection during firm load shed events called by ERCOT, I believe. So there's very specific language in their legislation that's going to be implemented in the next year. We can go on to my last section of slides, and this one's just a few on special contracts. We can go to the next one. So in contrast to the tariff that's publicly available, that gives the criteria for the utility rates and services, special contract is typically a bilateral contract between the utility and the customer. And oftentimes it's a negotiation and they give the customer a favorable rate, oftentimes to bring in economic development, to bring customers into their service territory. We can go on to the next slide. I thought that this was interesting because I think that the kind of assumption is that both the utility and the large load customers will think that special contracts are agreeable because they're can focus on the terms and conditions that are most important to both entities, and they're often confidential. And so there's less public scrutiny about them because they're often confidential contracts. But this is an example where Evergy in Missouri is arguing that they're spending too much time on special contracts and they would like to have a tariff because they think it's going to be more efficient rather than dealing with ad hoc, all of these different special contracts, negotiating them, sending them over to the commission for approval. Amazon in a proceeding in Indiana, so completely different proceeding, was talking about how they thought that the utility should be using a special contract and not going down this route of a tariff because they thought it would be more efficient. Ultimately, they ended up in Indiana using a tariff in conjunction with a special tariff or a special contract, actually, which I'll talk about in 2 slides. But so there's lots of different opinions on this. We can go on to the next one. As I was saying, there's One of the big complaints about special contracts is that there's a lack of transparency. As you all know, there's a docket that you have open in front of you that has quite a bit of information available in it as part of the special contract. It has information on the power purchase agreement quantity and cost. And the terms of the electric service agreement. There's a lot more richness of information in that docket than what I've seen in lots of special contract proceedings and dockets that I've been looking at. For example, in Indiana, there was this special contract between Meta and Duke Energy, and you don't know how much capacity was being procured. You don't know where it's being procured for. You don't know what the demand fee or energy charge was. The consumer advocate in Indiana they were able to review that confidential information, did say in their comments that this did not create additional costs for other customers. Um, and also one of the agreements that they came to was that future PPAs needed to be filed with the IURC, but we haven't seen any of those come through yet. We can go on to the next slide. This is an example of the tariff and special contract being used together. So Indiana has a tariff that was recently approved that had a lot of agreement, a lot of consensus, a lot of stakeholder engagement in the development of it. And as part of it, it was agreed upon that there would be an ability for the large loads to be able to procure clean energy through some kind of mechanism. And this is what was proposed recently, which is this clean capacity arrangement, where Google is going to be transferring long-term generation capacity that's accredited from their ownership to I&M. They're also going to be providing firm demand response to the utility as well. These seem like really great ideas. There's just not enough information in the special contract so we can really determine what's going on there. And so we'll have to leave it to, the consumer advocate and the commission staff to make sure that that's going to be fair and equitable to everyone who's participating, to all the ratepayers in Indiana. But my next 3 slides, we can keep going, are all on resources. So this first one, if we go to the first slide, is a picture of the tariff paper. That's the report that I talked about with the 4 different themes. We can go on to the next slide. This one has, the first link is this large load literature review. I've been consuming lots of information about data centers, and it's very hard to keep your head around how much is coming out on a daily basis. And so I created this literature review, and we put it out in July. Or at the beginning of August, and I have the next version of it that I need to review, and hopefully we'll get it published in the next few days or so. But we had about 60 different resources that we categorized into 11 different categories, and those are what's shown there. And so that's a helpful resource for when you're starting off. If you have a topic that you want to look into, at least it gives you a starting point of like what's out there to get your arms around it. So that's something that we're going to continue to update on a monthly basis, fingers crossed. The other one to point out here is the Center of Expertise in Data Centers. This is where my colleagues have their papers on the congressional reports on data center, which they've been doing every 8 years since 2008, and also a wide variety of resources on technology specific aspects of data centers. So not on the policy side, not on the tariff side as much, but much more about HVAC opportunities, what types of compute are available, what kind of demand flexibility could happen with those. And so that's just another very large resource that's available from the lab. I think that that is my last slide. I know that was a whirlwind tour, but I did want to make sure that we left time for our other speakers and maybe time for a few other questions, but I can always take questions offline too. Thank you for the opportunity to share this research.
Well, thank you, Natalie. If you wouldn't mind, I want to check to see if the commissioners have any questions or comments.
I would just say thank you for that overview. That was very uh, informative, and then especially that your resources page. I'm going to spend some time digging through that, and then listening also reminded me of an example. When I was saying data center benefits are real, one of the things that's a big conversation is how the electric grid is going to start relying more on AI data centers for things like speeding up interconnection studies and potentially grid dispatch and operations. And so this graphical interface processor aren't just for video games anymore. So thank you for reminding me that.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Energy Systems Integration Group, but they have a large load task force, and they are going to be talking specifically about how AI and interconnection or how AI is going to be used in system planning and how they've seen it being used in system planning and interconnection queues, et cetera, to try and speed things up as part of their fall conference. So it'd be a useful resource in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a fan of eSig.
Commissioner Nyberg, did you have any questions or comments?
No, just again, express my thanks.
And yeah, I also thank you for that presentation. And just by way of a question, I'm wondering whether you have any elements of these tariffs that you encourage or discourage regulators to require, maybe which ones you think are the most effective at providing certainty for a large customer and also uh, protecting uh, other customers from financial risk.
Yes. So I think that first I will say that while we looked at these different elements of the tariffs, that it's really important to look at the tariffs as a whole when you're thinking about the package. So like just one piece is not like you can take one piece that's really good, but you need the other pieces as well. And so I think in terms of consumer protections, ratepayer protections, and reduction in risk of stranded assets, having the long-term contracts is something that I think is a pretty strong way to protect consumers. I think in terms of risk of stranded assets, one of the things that I didn't get to mention is that some of the tariffs offer the capability for the large load customer to resize the load that they need to take. And so if they've overestimated what they need, they have an opportunity within the certain time window with, lesser or potentially no penalty to say like, hey, we don't need as much as we thought we did, and give it back to the system so that it can be used and allocated to other entities that also need electricity, that want to come online or grow. And so I think that that's a nice feature to offer to your large load customers. I think that what they have been saying is that I think the the large load customers are saying that they are willing to pay for all of the costs that they're bringing on the system. And I think that's a pretty common expression that most large loads are fine with. They don't want to put the burden of their costs onto other entities. I think having a very good look at your cost allocation approach and methodology and investigating if it's worthwhile for you to create a different customer class for your large loads is something that is important for both the large loads and also for your ratepayers to better understand how are these costs being allocated? What costs are really only benefiting one customer versus the entire system? Or what costs are benefiting the entire system that are being driven by these large loads that should be spread across, many different customers? So those are just a few thoughts, but there's many, many more things I could say, but I don't want to take up all the time.
Um, well, I appreciate again your presentation, and I do have just one last question. You went through a lot of or several different potential requirements or minimum requirements. Do the tariffs normally have all of these requirements? Well, maybe not all of them, but most of them, or are there some that don't really work together or mutually exclusive?
I don't know that there's any that I can think of off the top of my head that are mutually exclusive. I think that not all of the tariffs have provisions for enabling clean energy or for enabling large load customers to focus on things that are part of their corporate sustainability. I think that not all of the tariffs have the ability to reallocate capacity I think almost all of them have a minimum, um, have they all have terms on how long the contract must last. I think almost all of them have credit and collateral requirements. I think almost all of them have exit fees. So those are very common ones. Cost allocation is not always discussed is rarely discussed in the tariffs. That's often going to come out in your rate case. So you'll see the implications of it sometimes discussed, but the actual content of the cost allocation will typically not be in the tariff itself. And if it is, it's sometimes just even a sentence that says like, the customer is not going to the large load customer isn't going to put their costs onto other customers in the rate base. But that's all I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, thank you again for sharing your expertise with us. Our next presenters are from the Public Utility Commission of Nevada, and we have Swetha Venkat and Karen Oleski with us today to present. I'll turn it over to you, and thank you for presenting today.
Thank you for the invitation. My name is Karen Oleski, along with my coworker Swetha Venkat. We are two economists of the Nevada Commission, and how the Nevada Commission works is that we are on the regulatory operations side of staff, which means we appear before the commission as a party. We file our own testimony. We are not advisors to the commission. So with that, I need to give the standard disclaimer that we do not speak for the commission. We don't speak for any individual commissioners. We don't speak for our bosses. These opinions today are our opinions and our opinions only. However, there's a lot of dockets and casework we can point you to that has the official staff opinion if that's what you're looking for. So I'm going to jump right in with that. So to start, we had some questions that were sent to us, and two of which were asked about why the Clean Transition Tariff, or the CTT, you'll learn that we love to talk in acronyms, only applies to current customers, and is there something about the CTT design that only works for existing customers? And so for that, I really need to provide a brief history of large customer tariffs in Nevada, so stick with me here. So first, we had the Nevada Revised Statutes, Chapter 704B, that was put in a law in 2001, which allowed large customers with an average annual load of 1 megawatt or more to leave the electric company's bundled retail service. So we are vertically integrated here. This is a special thing where they would only become a distribution-only customer and then purchase their energy from an alternative provider in the market. To leave that bundled service, an existing customer has to pay an impact fee. An impact fee is meant to offset any stranded costs created by leaving the system that will be passed on to non-participants. So just for example, if it doesn't make sense, say you go out to eat with 9 of your friends, everyone orders food and drinks with the agreement to split the bill based on what each person ordered, but then halfway through, one person leaves and they don't throw in cash for what they ordered. So when the bill comes, you have the option of spreading that cost to the 9 remaining people or Venmoing that 10th person what their fair share is of the bill. So impact fee is meant to be that Venmo payment. And then going forward, instead of saying NRS Chapter 704B, we call it 704B, 704B customer going 704B. But this is what I mean. So then in 2019, the 704B law was changed again, and that expanded it to allow future customers to apply to take service from an alternative provider if they are not bundled retail. So the key here is future customer. So for example, a new casino, again, we're in Nevada, is breaking ground. They're not yet a bundled customer because they're only under construction power. They could file to go 704B saying they never want to be a bundled retail customer. They want to automatically start buying energy from the market. In that case, they would have a 0 impact fee. So just going back to my eating example, 9 people are at the restaurant. You're waiting for that 10th person before anyone orders. That 10th person calls and says they're not going to make dinner, or they're not going to make it to the dinner. So the other 9 people go ahead, order food and drinks for only those 9 people. You wouldn't have anything to Venmo that 10th person because you didn't plan for that person. You didn't order for that person. So that's why there's a 0 impact fee. So that's the history of 704B. And then during the mid-2010s, there was a overwhelming amount of 704B applications, to put it nicely. Customers were saying they thought they could get cheaper energy in the market. They wanted to lock in a consistent rate for a long period of time. They want to be powered by more renewable energy. There was a ton of reasons they wanted to go, and they were trying to go. Obviously, the electric company kind of wanted to stem that loss of load and entice new large customers instead of getting that zero impact fee and just never becoming a customer. They wanted the new load to stay with them. In late 2019, the utilities created a marginal pricing tariff. So that's MPE. And for that, the customer has to be 1 megawatt or more and approved to be a 704B customer without an impact fee. That tariff was made specifically for the Raiders Stadium and I think 3 other customers. There's a very niche tariff that was made to try to, woo them back, if you will. So it's explicitly not available to existing bundled customers or to any 704B customers that had an impact fee. Again, it was just for these 4 customers. And I do not recommend creating tariffs specifically for a single customer. We have learned that lesson, sharing that now. Make sure your tariff's more broadly applicable. There is a fixed rate component, and the basis of that pricing is a renewable resource. So you can meet your renewable energy goals through this, even though this is called a marginal pricing tariff. There is that renewable aspect of it. And as I said, an example is the NFL stadium for the Raiders. Then also in 2019, the utilities created a large customer marginal pricing tariff, LCMPE. And those are for customers with an average hourly load of 10 megawatts or more and are not fully bundled. Again, they're not an existing customer. And they were also not given a 704B status. So this was made for a brand new casino coming in. It's called Resorts World. You can also look that one up. I think Swatha might talk about that a little bit more. Again, don't make tariffs for one customer. It gets messy. We did it twice. So we have 2 tariffs for non-existing customers. So this is how I'm going to get to the CTT, which was what I was actually asked to talk about. So we did have 2 other similar failed tariffs for existing customers, so I won't go into those. So this is definitely a lot of trial and error and lesson learned. Again, we started this in 2019. It's 2025. We're still learning a lot. So for the CTT, we had a customer in one of our general rate cases ask for a clean tariff or a marginal pricing tariff, if you will, since they're based on renewable resources for existing customers, because that did not exist. The commission decided to open an investigation to figure out how or what a CTT would look like. However, the utility chose not to use the investigatory process and just filed the tariff. They are filed for approval. We can ask to have them go to contested proceedings, which we did. You can see our testimony online. We did finalize that or approve that via settlement. So I can't really go into why there's certain things in the tariff are the way they are because our settlement discussions are confidential here, unfortunately, but you can read our testimony and get a very good insight into staff's concerns. And that one's for the clean transition tariff. The 5 megawatt threshold was chosen, and the company said they chose that, and this is in rebuttal, it's not secret, was to limit the number of participants, so it wouldn't be a complete free-for-all. So, sorry, I keep getting email pop-ups. So hopefully this history explained a little bit of why the CTT is only available for existing customers, because we have tariffs for customers who are future customers. But also, I think it really highlights the important thing is that you shouldn't take one state's tariff and then put it in your state. Even if you think, oh, 5 megawatts doesn't mean much, that sounds good, or the term of it sounds good, there's probably a very long history, a contested history of why it's 5 megawatts or why the term is 25 years. So you really need to look at what's best for your state and not just pick up and place down, unfortunately. I know it would make it easier. So in doing that, I'm going to talk about some policy considerations you should have when you are making your own tariff. Earlier, there was a comment in the meeting about whether there should be regulatory certainty and rules. And that is sort of what we have. So we heard from the utility, we heard from the parties that they want both predictability and flexibility. So here the utility will file an energy supply agreement. It's an ESA. That is how a customer takes service under the MPE, the CTT, the LCMPE is with an energy supply agreement. And so that's filed for approval by the commission in a contested proceeding. And so the tariffs state what should be in the ESA which is the legal contract between the utility and the customer. And it also says what should be in the ESA application. And that's where all the supporting information can be found, and not in the legal contract, obviously, in the docket. But it's not overly prescriptive because different customers have different energy needs, such as a data center versus a seasonal sports stadium. They might have different renewable goals, just different goals altogether. So while the tariff gives predictability and the utility shall include this in their filing or shall include that, it's not to a specific or micromanaged level of you must do this one exact thing. It's more broad, like include this information and whatever that information might be. And I'll kind of get into that as we go. I know that's kind of vague right there. But before I get into more of the specific what should be in there, there's really 3 foundational questions I think you should all ask yourselves if you're going to start doing a tariff for large customers. And one is, what is the purpose of your tariff? Is it to bring new load? Is it to meet large customers' renewable goals that are above an RPS? Is it lower rates for larger customers? And once you decide what that is, that will also inform what level of non-participating customer subsidy is acceptable. Is it 0? Or is the ultimate goal to bring new load at all costs? So having non-participant customers pay something for this is okay. Like that's pretty foundational that I think you should decide right off the bat. And the second, assuming the commission is going to approve these energy supply agreements and they're not just going to be rubber stamped approval upon filing, what's the standard that you want to use to review these contracts? How do you know what's a good contract? So we have some things such as, does the ESA increase cost to non-participants? We also have some language about, will it create a loss of benefits to non-participants? And to explain that one, so say, for example, you're predicting that residential customers' rates will decrease by, their bills will decrease $1 a month. But if we got the ESA, those residential customers' bills would not decrease, they would stay the same. So while you're not adding an increased cost necessarily, that is a loss of benefits. Those non-participants would have had a lower rate, but for that ESA. So that's something else we look at too. It's not just, will it increase the cost, but will you lose benefits? There's tons of other standards to use, but I think you should determine early on is what standard you're going to use. And that enables you to get the information you need to determine that standard. So going into the third foundational question is building on that. Is what data do you need in the ESA and the ESA application, and what detail do you need that information for commission review? If you think you want it, put it in the tariff. Don't assume that any information that's discussed when making the tariff in a workshop or an informal setting will actually end up in the ESA applications. If it's not required by tariff, it will not be in there. And if you want detail, you have to ask for detail. So for example, saying the ESA must provide benefits to the grid or benefits to non-participants. Is it a list of benefits? Is that acceptable to you? Do you need the benefits quantified? Do you need a report? Do you need a model? While it makes sense now to say provide benefits, anyone can write a sentence and say it benefits non-participants because X, but is that good enough for you? So something else to really think about. Now I'm getting down kind of into the nitty gritty. Again, I don't want to tell you exactly why we chose some of the things we chose. I'll go into detail where I can. But since all of these, the MPE, the LCMPE, and the CTT have renewable resources as the underlying generating resource, do you want the ESA to use an existing resource? So by that, I mean something that's already been approved by the commission for the benefit of all ratepayers. Where there could be a loss of benefits with that, because now you're taking, whether it's energy, whether it's portfolio energy credits, you're essentially taking something from all ratepayers and giving it to one large customer. Is that acceptable? It could be. Or must it be a new resource? So we have ours filed with a new resource that to file the ESA and approval for the new resource in an integrated resource plan. They have to be filed concurrently to show commission, if you approve this resource, it's not solely for all customers. Part of it will be allocated to this one dedicated customer. Again, something to consider. I can't guide you one way or the other. It really depends. Going back to that foundational question one is, what is the purpose of your tariff and how are you going to enable that to meet that purpose, to succeed in that. Something else to consider is the minimum size to participate. As I went through our tariffs, we have a 1 megawatt, we have a 10 megawatt, we have a 5 megawatt. The MPE 1 megawatt matched the 704B statute. 10 megawatt matched a large customer. 5 megawatt was to allow customers to do this without it being overwhelming. So again, what do you want? How do you want everyone to do this? Are you trying to track just those really large data centers? Going back to your purpose, that should help you set your minimum size to participate. When you're talking about that minimum size, can a customer aggregate? So again, here in Las Vegas, can 2 casino properties that are under common control and common budget, can they aggregate to meet the 5 megawatts or the 10 megawatts? Or does it have to be one contiguous property? That is something to think about when you're saying how to get to that minimum load, what works for that. Also, what happens if a customer's load, so say we're going with 5 megawatts, what if they drop below that? Again, in Nevada, we're super sensitive to tourism. We've had a lot of tourists not show up this summer. I'm sure if you read the news in Las Vegas, it's been a slump here. And we have a lot of open rooms. And so what if this slump goes on for another 3 years and a customer can't meet its minimum load size? And we use an average annual load, by the way. So what if they can't meet that average annual load? Are they kicked off their energy supply agreement? Is there a contingency in there? Would they go back to their otherwise applicable rate schedule? Do you have to amend the ESA? So think of contingencies, because it makes sense now, but no one saw COVID coming. No one saw 2008 recession coming. And those things happen a lot. So what happens if the customer's load falls, but also what happens if the customer's load doubles? What if we're in a boom and that casino builds a second tower? Can that second tower automatically take that rate? Do they have to file another application? At what point is it okay to adjust that? I think CTT says you can have a 10% load growth adjustment and still be on this ESA. Anything above that would require an amendment. Something else to think about. So I briefly mentioned we use an average annual load. That's something we learned over time. We were saying you need 1 megawatts, but 1 megawatt when? In the summer when it's 120 degrees here, in the winter when no one shows up. So we did an average annual load of 1 megawatt. So something else to consider is how you're going to measure that. Is it one-time peak load, average annual? And we also thought there's, again, fluctuations in cooling load here. In customer, we have different customer seasons here, very touristy town. So we decided to do the annual. So think about that. What does that time period matter for you? That way we could knock out any seasonal variability. Something else to think about. I briefly mentioned amendments to the ESA. If the commission is approving this, what kind of wiggle room do you want to allow the utility to have to continue this ESA without getting commission approval of those changes? Are there any? Is it every? Something else to think about. We have clauses in there that if there's a material change, mostly to that underlying renewable resource, Swathe is going to talk about the pricing. I know that's what everyone wants to hear about. But if that renewable resource changes, what if it doesn't come online or it fails for whatever reason? We believe in Nevada that you should have a new resource and therefore a new rate, because a rate is tied to the resource. We did not structure some of the earlier tariffs and ESAs that way. So you actually won't see it that way if you go back to the history that I went through, if you start looking at the tariff language. But if there's a material change in the price or the term or something else, we believe the commission needs to see that for approval. If it's, again, not material, which is, again, it was made vague on purpose because the parties want flexibility. But if something minor, then they don't need to actually ask for and receive commission approval. So start thinking about that as what do you really care about and what is okay to go on as is. So then going back to the renewable resource, do you want one resource that is 100% allocated to this customer? For example, they bring their own resource, or can this customer use 10 megawatts of a 500 megawatt solar facility? Is that okay? Is it not okay? Things to consider. Just again, I'm not saying what's right or wrong, but you got to do what's best for your state to meet that goal that we talked about earlier. The big thing is the rate. Everyone wants to know what that customer is paying, because then that can impact if there is going to be a subsidy or not, if a subsidy is allowed. So is there a rate methodology to get to that energy supply agreement rate? Or is the rate negotiated in secret between the utility and the customer? Which one is preferable? If it's a methodology, do you want the commission to approve that methodology or approve that model? If it's negotiated, is there room for the commission to adjust that up or down, or is it a take it or leave it price? Something else to consider. Swathe will go into the model. Termination, we heard a little bit about that from Natalie. Not just do you allow termination, meaning do you allow that ESA customer to get out of their ESA contract, but is there a cost? And also when? So if you're bringing a new resource, can you get out of your ESA before that resource is even online? What if that resource you brought is really expensive and the utility would not have procured it otherwise, but for your ESA? Can you back out of that ESA and now saddle the non-participants with this higher renewable resource cost that would not have existed but for? So again, something to think about there is, what would that termination look like? The cost, the terms. A big one is the duration of the ESA versus the life of the resource. As we've gone on, we have matched them. And if you don't match it, we do say in the tariff, please explain why the ESA life does not match the life of the resource. Again, you'll see this has changed over time. If you're going back to the MPE and the LCMP and you're saying, Karen, that's not what they say. Yes, we have learned over time through a painful trial and error process. But we like them to match because this resource is partially or fully dedicated to that customer. We believe they should pay that price, the ESA rate, for the duration minus any early termination. I guess a couple final notes here. Get your accountants involved early and often. I'm an economist. Swathe is an economist. We can think of really great policies and make some super cool models. But if it's hard to track or it's overly complicated in the rate making, you're going to struggle when it comes time to those rate cases. And you don't want to wait till a rate case to be locked into a 25-year-long headache. So just because something sounds cool and it looks cool, I cannot tell you how many times our accounting manager just shakes his head at me. And he's like, no, that you can't do it. So think about that. Also, so we allow the company to own its renewable resources, not just power purchase agreements. We have found there's some difficulties with company-owned resource. That is still an ongoing proceeding. Swathe may or may not touch on that, but we have not filed our second round of testimony on that one yet. But if it's, those accountings are different. If it's a power purchase agreement or it's a rate-based. So you have to think about that, how that will impact your ESA, will impact your rates. And then something I've kind of been harping on is that we all know, or should all know from rulemakings, that you will think you have crafted the best tariff. There's no way you didn't think of any contingencies that could happen. Like, you just know it's the best. And then you get the very first ESA and there's a nuance you didn't think of, or this doesn't apply and there's a waiver. So that's okay. But you need to be flexible on it and be like, okay, maybe we've had 3 ESAs and the tariff as we imagined it isn't working. We have to redo this tariff. The LCMPE was filed under a contested case. So we took it to a hearing with testimony. We had an investigation. Then we had a second LCMPE hearing based on the results of that investigation. So we've gone through many iterations, and that's okay. But I would say be prepared and be willing to do that. Customer needs change. Data center load growth wasn't the Nevada issue. It was casinos. It's always casinos. We didn't have sports stadiums 10 years ago. Now we do. So your tariffs will need to change as your customer needs change, and maybe your purpose of the tariff changes too. So just be ready to change those. So I think with that, I'm just going to pass it over to Swatha to talk about the good stuff, about the modeling.
Thanks, Karen. Good morning, commissioners and attendees. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As Karen said, and very reflective of economists, we love our models. So I will get into how we're doing our CTT model pricing. So in the current CTT cases, Nevada Power has proposed a pricing model which it used to calculate the CTT ESA rates in each of the dockets. We originally had three, one of which settled and two of which are pending. The model incorporates both customer-specific information such as load and resource-specific information such as production and pricing. But basically, it's the same framework across the three that we had. It is very similar to the approved pricing model used for the LCMPE tariff. As Karen said, that's kind of one of the things to think about whether, you want to have that starting baseline with an approved model or not. However, we do not have a pricing model for the CTT. Per the commission's order in the tariff docket, NV Energy is required to file its pricing model for approval in the next IRP or IRP amendment, whichever comes first. So what our current model does is applies a fixed ESA rate for the hours that the underlying resource is producing energy, and we call that resource hours. And the customer would pay its otherwise applicable rate for all other hours, which are the grid hours. The rate is fixed for the entire term of the ESA, which so far has been in the range of 20 to 25 years, which is that length to align with the life of the resource. What the CTT ESA rate includes is the cost of the generating facilities, which so far has usually been solar and battery, but has also included geothermal. It also includes an administrative fee, which is meant to offset the costs to other participants of having utility employees negotiate the ESA, run separate billing, any of that type of thing. It also includes a planning reserve margin cost that requires the customer to, as part of its ESA rate, to contribute to the planning reserve margin. And the next portion is specific to the CTT, a capacity protection component that is applied to equalize the ESA rate to the otherwise applicable rate. So one of the things that the CTT has is if we run our model and come up with a rate that is less than what the customer is paying under its otherwise applicable rate, there will be a component added to that rate to make sure it's equal, at least at the time the ESA is filed for approval. During resource hours, customers also receive a generation credit associated with not using grid energy. This has actually been consistent throughout our large customer tariffs. So that applies to the MPE, the LCMPE, and the CTT. The generation credits are the same across those tariffs. So that's kind of the description of what's going on right now with CTT pricing. And as I started to think about what I would tell folks who are thinking about a similar tariff is, and Karen touched on a lot of these, but the impact to non-participating ratepayers, specifically for the potential of non-participants to subsidize the contracts for large customers. That is the main issue we've grappled with in the CTT dockets, and also something we've brought up previously in the MPE and LCMPE. Much of our issue is related to the fixed price and the generation credits that are offered during resource hours. And in our dockets, well, at least the one we filed testimony for, we do believe there is subsidization occurring. Okay, so what I would tell someone who's considering such a tariff. Regarding subsidization, I think first I'd look into or decide whether it is an issue. I can see in some instances it may not be an issue, and I think Natalie kind of touched on these two, is perhaps the attraction of a particular customer and or facility is beneficial for the system as a whole. or the law allows or encourages it, for example, through for economic development purposes, or perhaps there's a limited amount of large customer participation. I know that last piece, the limited amount of large customer participation for our first tariff for the MPE, that was something that came up that we knew it didn't apply to that many customers. If you do decide that this is an issue, the next question would be, is there a threshold amount that is acceptable? So for example, are you okay with, $1 million of subsidization going on every year? And then after that point, it's too much and we need to do something about it. So is there a threshold, and what would you do if you're on the other side of it? And when looking at potential subsidization, are you going to consider benefits in offsetting that potential subsidization? And if you are, this also gets back to one of Karen's points as to what's required in the tariff. Definitely think about what type of benefits demonstration you'd want to see, and whether it needs to be, quantified or listed, that type of thing, and whether it needs to be memorialized in a tariff. Ours do require, I think, a listing of the benefits, but that's not to say that a customer can't provide a quantification of benefits. We've had other ESAs, I think under another tariff, where customers have provided that, which in that particular case, I think was beneficial. But with the benefits demonstration, sometimes you do go down that road of, how did they quantify it? Did they quantify it right? Going in as an economist, are those assumptions right? If I change the assumption, the benefits change, all that type of stuff. And if you decide that subsidization is a no-go, we don't want any of it, I would think about how it can be prevented when the contract is being considered for approval. Since our paradigm involves a fixed price, my focus has been on working off of NV Energy's model and recommending model adjustments with the goal of estimating the best price possible. Again, since ours is fixed for the life of the term, 20 to 25 years, I've also recommended that a premium is added to the customer's rate, and that is for the purpose of compensating non-participating customers for the potential of an understated price. So, if we got that price wrong, there's a little adder from the get-go. This is what we're recommending. There is an adder from the get-go to provide something to non-participants. Another way of looking at that premium is a payment by the ESA customer for the ability to fix a price for such a long period of time. That is not available to all customer classes, and we've stated this in testimony that residential customers and small business customers don't do that, and the ability to fix a price does have benefits, and therefore it should be paid for. So that's kind of the first thing, the impact on non-participating ratepayers. Is it an issue? Is it not? The next thing I would consider is whether or not to have a approved model or methodology to determine a price. We've kind of talked about whether, you want the special contracts to be really flexible and have the ability to look at it on a contract by contract basis or not. With an approved methodology, one good thing is that you'd have the same starting point for all customers, which is easier to compare across contracts over time, and more consistent treatment across customers over time. The downside is the same methodology or model may not be applicable in all cases, and if so, how would such deviations be handled? If you don't have an approved model or methodology, that provides for maximum flexibility to consider any type of special contract. And given this is kind of new, it may be useful in that we don't know what type of, customers, contracts, resources, or really what's going on at the specific time you're considering the special contract when it's brought forward. So that provides for maximum flexibility. But you may have a perception of inconsistent treatment across customers or contracts over time. We do have a commission-approved model for one of our large large customer pricing tariffs, the LCMPE. And what we did was we recommended and the commission adopted an approved model, which needs to be used as the starting point, but anyone can recommend modifications to the model in testimony. And the customer is not required to take the price that results from that baseline model. And the approved model methodology really came up because of our experience with the LCMPE and the associated investigation. That particular tariff has, I think, 2 approved ESAs that look very different. One was a longer term one with a fixed price for the entire term. The second one that was considered ended up having a much shorter term. I think it's only 6 years. So because of those differences, we kind of went down that path of, let's at least have the same starting point for everybody. And that gets back to what Karen was saying before, the need to balance consistency with flexibility. And I don't know how I'm doing on time. I have one more thing I can talk about regarding pricing.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so going back to the fixed price, that's kind of what we have been. That was our baseline from the beginning. So our initial first ESA under the NPE tariff had the fixed price, and that's kind of been part of our paradigm during this whole process. I don't know that the price needs to be fixed, but I'm not really familiar with how the variable rate pricing would work either. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. If you do go down the road of having a fixed price, how long is the price going to be fixed? As I said, we've had some examples where it was a fixed energy price for all hours for 25 years. And one where they had a fixed price for all hours for only 6 years, and they would need to come back for an subsequent ESA. Our most recent iteration only allows a fixed price for the resource hours where the underlying resource is producing power and they're paying the otherwise applicable rate other hours. So those are just a few questions I think to keep in mind. I don't have any observations as to how it's all working right now, because even though we've had some ESAs that were approved, in 2019 and 2020, the underlying resources are only coming online now. So going forward, we're going to see how that's working. And those are all my comments regarding pricing.
Well, thank you for those presentations. You certainly gave us a lot to think about. And maybe left us with more questions than answers, but it's not a simple thing, and there is a lot to think about. And so I have a question, and then wanted to check with the other commissioners, and also if you're on the Zoom and you have some questions, please start raising your hands. I think we have a little bit of time for that. So I think in an ideal world, the way I was thinking about tariff is that there would be a tariff and associated contracts with the tariff that set the requirements. And if there is a customer who wants to accept those, they can execute those agreements with the utilities. And that, I think, is one way to provide just in reasonable terms that the commission has already provided. It sounds like it's not that easy, right? Some of them come with their own resources. Um, and I do think it would be appropriate. I think one of the things you mentioned, Karen, is if you have, are you going to accept any changes? What kind of changes? I think in an ideal world, we would have this tariff and these contracts in their standard form. And if they're executed, then we've already found that they're just and reasonable. But if there are changes, because sometimes customers need flexibility, then we would review those changes. Um, but anyway, it sounds like it's not that easy, like, because customers come with their own um, requests, resources maybe. Do you have any reaction to that? Can it be simpler, such that, and I know I'm also speaking to the advocacy staff, and so I'm sure you want to review, any additional terms. So anyway, I don't know if there's a clear question there, but maybe if you have a reaction to that.
Absolutely, Commissioner. So we did start with having pro forma ESAs filed with us to kind of give a feel for what the contracts will look like, but they're not essentially, that's not a binding contract. A customer can come in and completely change that pro forma, that blank contracts. We did try to simplify it and found there was too many differences between what was needed between each customer who's applying. I would say the contracts aren't too different. There's a lot of the basic stuff, definitions you can repeat. But again, if you want to use a modeled rate, that really helps figuring out, okay, you can kind of write that in, use this model. If it's a free for all, as Swetha was saying, then maybe every contract can be very, very different. I would say if you want to look at any and all changes or what your threshold for looking at changes, I would put that in the tariff. Our big one is about the resource because that's what the rate is based on, the ESA rate, which then informs how big the subsidy will be for non-participants. So if that resource changes, we think we need to know, did it come online later than expected? We've had that a lot here in Nevada where the CODs, commercial operation days, are pushed back. We need to know that because as Swetha was saying, that ESA rate doesn't start getting charged to that ESA customer until that underlying resource is online. So we need to know about that as a change. If there's a price, some of our contracts, so for the company owned resource that's called Sierra Solar, for for the Sphere, the big giant ball in Las Vegas. Everyone's seen that. It's a big concert stadium. We currently have a docket open with that, so I can't go into too much detail. But in their ESA, it does say if the commission approves a price change for Sierra Solar, because that's company owned, so they can increase costs for construction. There could be increased O&M costs. There's decommissioning costs. Then the Sphere's rate, ESA rate, will change accordingly. So we do have that language in there, and that's not a commission approved change. If the commission approves that price change for residential ratepayers, for all ratepayers, it automatically goes to the ESA customer who's using that resource, as opposed to a PPA, which obviously has a locked-in 25-year, 30-year price. So that price wouldn't change. So you can build that into your tariff. But yeah, our big amendment is if you change the resource, we need to know, we need to approve it, we need to approve a new rate. So that's the big one for us.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and um, just trying to balance the, I guess, efficiencies and predictability gained by having a set tariff and potentially set like pro forma agreements and balancing that with the flexibility that might be needed to recognize differences among customers. So certainly you gave us a lot to think about, and I appreciate your perspective and your experience. It's clear that you've spent a lot of time thinking about this and have the battle scars to prove it. So thank you. Commissioners, do you have any questions? questions or comments?
No, I think you said it pretty well, a lot to think about, and so thank you for that. And then just showing how the richness of these large loads is a bigger question than just a monolithic data center. And even within data centers, they're not all the same. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and I do see one hand up from former Commissioner Fishman. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this has been really interesting. And apropos your comments about how do we make this simpler, I always struggled with that when I was on the commission. And I've had this idea that I'm hoping the Nevada folks can maybe give some insight on. And it's big picture, but I'll throw it out there and tell me what you guys think. I've toyed with the idea that now that if you've got net meter, if you've got automated metering across your system, that the idea that you need to look at load factors and have rate classes kind of goes out the window, because now essentially you have the load factor for every individual customer. And would it make sense to say, to set for the energy side of the customer's bill, a one rate that's time of use that applies across all customer classes? This is just the energy side, because now, whether you're using your energy at an expensive time of day or a cheap time of day, we've got that on the meter for everybody. And I think it has an advantage that it gives incentive to everybody to follow price signals and truly realize the idea of cost causation in terms of the time of day that you use your energy. If there were special needs or special things that happened across customers, you could then have a baseline that if you needed to make an adjustment because there were other factors, it'd be very clear why. And you wouldn't be going through all this complicated different rate setting for each customer class on the energy side of things. Do you think that kind of structure could work?
Waiting to see if Swetha unmuted. Well, first, I'm not sure if that structure would meet those large customers' goals. If they're here in Nevada, their goal is to have more renewable energy than what the state's RPS is. So there has to be a way to get them more renewable energy, more renewable credits, and then charge them appropriately for that. So I don't think, I do think we do have to have a specific rate for that customer so they can meet their goal. And then just generally speaking, Swetha and I live in Las Vegas. We're not that, we know what time of use is. It's not mandatory down here. When it's 120 degrees out, your AC is going to run all the time. So we do have optional time of use rates, but we don't mandate them. So we are familiar, we have them, but we don't use them that often down here.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see Angela's hand up, so maybe we can take that one as the last one. Please go ahead, Angela, and then we'll move on to our next presenter. Thank you for your patience, Ari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to let you know that Commissioner Nybert's internet is unstable and he's unable to come back to the meeting. He wanted me to thank the presenters for coming and for the information, as well as to apologize for not being able to finish the meeting in full, but I will make sure to brief him on all of the information he misses. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so I think with that, we're ready for our next presenter, who is Ari Pascoe from Harvard Law School's Electricity Law Initiative. So Ari, thanks for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I do have some slides that I will attempt to put up on the screen. 1 second, please. Bear with me. Just so you don't have to look at my face during the presentation. I'll give you something more interesting and colorful and pretty to look at. Let's see if I can make the Zoom magic happen here. And all right, that should do it, hopefully. All right. So again, thanks again for having me. I'm gonna run through this paper that I put out with my colleague Eliza Martin back in March, and with some updated observations and framing. Whenever you kind of put out one of these things, there's always, you talk to a lot of people about it and you realize you wish you had written things differently. So I'm not just going to regurgitate the paper, but if you've read it, I'm gonna kind of hit on a lot of the same themes. And the title of the paper kind of here kind of gives my perspective on the issue, that I think it's just based on how we regulate utilities, the public ends up paying for data center energy costs. These industrial scale computing facilities, are often being used by the world's wealthiest corporations, and that raises obvious equity issues, and that these corporations are effectively causing our electricity bills to go up in a time when there are many other factors that are also causing electricity bills go up. We wrote this paper when there weren't too many people talking nationally about this issue, and now it seems like every day there's a new article in the Washington Post, the New York Times, regional papers, TV, et cetera, talking about this issue. So this issue is not going away, this ratepayer impact. I had an opportunity to listen in some of the previous presentation, and there obviously deep expertise in Nevada raised a lot of the similar questions that I'm going to raise in this presentation, but kind of do it from a national perspective. We dove into dockets across the country for this, as well as looked at some federal FERC issues as well. So, we know this power demand is growing. Data centers are a driving force here. I really just want to highlight a couple things. One is the uncertainty here. I've underlined this Encore projection, Encore, a Texas utility that has talked about that has nearly 200 gigawatts in its interconnection queue. The entire ERCOT market is about 80, 85 gigawatts peak. So the idea that they're going to sort of significantly to that level, significantly increase the load in Texas seems fantastical. And one of the challenges here is separating the sort of speculative load from the actual developments. I'll get into how utilities are trying to distinguish between speculation and sort of real projects later in the presentation. But we really don't know what's going to happen here. And obviously this is all sensitive to sort of global economic trends, right? This AI data center use is only a few years old, that we've seen this sort of call for dramatic escalation in energy use by these computing facilities. And it seems like a legit trend. It's happening. The top companies are spending $500 billion this year alone worldwide on these industrial scale computing facilities. But we don't know how long this trend is going to last, and what sort of technological innovation is going to dramatically flip things here. Who knows? Or maybe this is the path we're on for the rest of our lives. No one knows. And there's some tricky incentives here. Obviously, utilities profit from capital expenses, right? And this is like the simplest, most straightforward way to deploy capital is to feed these giant facilities. A few years ago, when we were talking about load growth, at least the circles that I run in, a lot of folks were excited about distributed load growth because we're all going to have electric vehicles, or we were going to electrify heat, things like that. And so that was a very different sort of load growth challenge than this challenge that I would argue utilities have historically been more comfortable with, which is just sort of individual, very large facilities that you can sort of hook up to a new natural gas-fired power plant, connect a few, reinforce your local transmission system, and voila, billions of dollars of CapEx are suddenly right there. This is also, I would say, the load growth different from earlier eras, right? So, you know, and if you know, the encore growth is just spectacular, and you have to probably go back to the 50s and 60s to see that sort of load growth, you know, where utilities are sort of doubling or even more than that, their load over the course of a decade or two. I think we're in a fundamentally different era from the 1950s and 60s. I think the biggest difference is that back then, the electric utility industry was a declining cost industry, right? Which meant that utilities were capitalizing on economies of scale, that is, power plants were getting larger, and that was leading to more efficient power plants. They were also more efficient thermodynamically. We're still sort of like the industry was still sort of hadn't hit the thermodynamic limits of burning coal, which they reached back in the 50s, if not the 60s. And so everybody was benefiting from load growth because the next power plant the utility built was going to be more efficient than the one that it retired. And so load growth, you could sort of justify it as good for everyone, even if there are some short-term costs, because over the long terms, you'd be decreasing the overall cost of your system. I don't have a lot of confidence that that sort of trend always holds up these days. It seems like a lot of things are costing more. Just a couple of quick charts that are very recent, so didn't make the report back from March. The first on the left, these two charts just show, you know, this is a nationwide phenomenon. You know, it does vary by state. You know, here in the Northeast, we don't see a whole lot just because we have very high electricity prices, but this is a nationwide phenomenon, this data center growth. And then on the right, the size of these facilities is just tremendous. This is showing the average size of facilities expected to come online in each year. And you see we're approaching where the average size of one of these facilities is 500 megawatts, right? So think about what that means in a system in New Mexico and what kind of spectacular growth that is. That is a large city suddenly materializing, or electrically a large city. I'm not going to go into the background of utility rate cases, obviously, for this audience. That's not at all necessary. What I want to zero in on, though, is the cost allocation challenge, because to me that's at the heart of everything with these new computing facilities. Who's paying for them? Well, it depends on how we allocate the costs of all the infrastructure and sort of market effects of these new facilities. So there's no objective correct answer to how to allocate costs. There's certainly wrong answers. But you know, you've been in rate cases and you know that when there's a cost allocation issue, each interest group comes with its own cost of service study that says this is how you ought to think about cost allocation. And there's various different methodologies for allocating those costs, but there's not a physics problem. And so there's no one precise way to allocate cost. There's a high level principle, cost causation, but that can manifest itself in different ways. There's a related principle that we use at the transmission level for FERC transmission costs, which is beneficiary pays. That is, if you're expected to benefit from a new transmission investment because energy costs are going to go down, because reliability is going to be improved, then you should pay some commensurate share of the cost based on, you know, the proportion of benefits that you ought to receive. I think a lot of the methodologies we use, though, here are maybe not appropriate for this challenge. I think we need to really kind of, and I don't have the right answer to this, but maybe question some of the fundamental assumptions of utility regulation. Who bears the risks associated with this massive infrastructure build out associated with these computing facilities? My contention is that ratepayers should not bear any of these risks. And so if we're going to put all of the risks on somebody else, it's got to be either the utility shareholders or the data centers themselves. And then so that's the risk piece of it. What happens if these facilities don't use as much energy, are not developed at all? How do we prevent sort of stranded assets being absorbed by the public? That's one set of risks. And then a second challenge is, what about the actual cost? Assuming that everything does work out as projected, should we still be using the same assumption that, well, the utilities built a new transmission line, you know, it's part of the sort of interconnected network, and so we're all in a sense taking service from that transmission line? Do we all pay for it, even though the but-for cause of that transmission line is this new computing facility? So, you know, I think there are different answers to that question. My contention is really that some of the traditional methods we use to allocate those costs ought to account for the fact that costs are now being driven primarily by particular facilities. So the simplest way is that the public ends up paying for these computing energy costs is just by socializing infrastructure development, right? The utility says, oh, demand is expected to increase over the next few years, so we need to build all this new infrastructure to meet demand. And the conventional approach is just sort of socializing those costs across the service territory. And we see this across the country. One tiny example that we highlight in the paper to show that this can be a tricky problem is there's a data center coming to Virginia, which is Dominion service territory. It's a $23 million new substation needed to serve this data center. And so the only reason they're building this new substation is to serve this new 200 megawatt data center. And so you might say, well, the data center is the but-for cost, and so it ought to pay that $23 million substation cost. But Dominion had decided, at least at the time when they filed this application, that in theory, that substation could serve future unidentified economic growth in the region. And therefore, they were going to flow the cost through their transmission tariff, which the costs are allocated across the entire service territory. So is that the right way to approach that problem? That's what the utility was choosing to do, even though that $23 million piece of infrastructure was at the time only being built for the data center. This sort of idea of sort of socializing costs then interacts with how data centers are taking service in many states, and that is through these secret contracts or special contracts where the data center and the utility have negotiated some deal. And then in many states, but not all states, the utility then has to file that contract with the utility commission for its approval. And to me, this is problematic. It's a confidential deal, and the only way you can access it, obviously, regulators have access to the deal, of course. And anybody that typically, if you participate in the proceeding, you can see the contract as well. But it ends up being obviously a very one-sided proceeding. Because unlike a rate case where you have a lot of interest groups that are motivated to participate and provide evidence, and hopefully the regulator's job is to sort out that evidence and come up with a sort of just and reasonable rate, here you're primarily hearing one side of the story. You're really just hearing evidence from the utility, which is trying to justify its deal, and there's often not a lot of incentive for other parties to participate in a robust manner. So as a regulator, you either just accept the evidence in the record, which is just presented by the utility, and approve the deal, or you reject the deal, and that's sort of often politically difficult to do because some of these deals come with a lot of political momentum. The governor makes an announcement, that sort of thing, and so it may be tough to reject such sort of deals. And again, this is getting back to like the utility's incentive here, which is to try to grow its load. And a classic problem in utility regulation is how do you prevent the utility from basically exploiting its monopoly in order to benefit in some competitive market. Here, the competitive market is attracting data centers. We see utilities across the country trying to attract this load, touting to investors all the growth that they're seeing due to data centers. Just look at like any quarterly earnings report from any investor-owned utility, and you'll see that as part of their presentation. So they're competing with each other to try to attract this load, and there's this risk that they're going to exploit their monopoly in order to sort of win that competition. So these things all come together in Louisiana, where I don't remember the exact date. Many months ago, the governor of Louisiana makes a big announcement. Meta is coming. They're investing, at the time it was announced, $10 billion. Now it's much more than that, but $10 billion in a part of the state where that sort of economic investment is just sort of unheard of. And so big fanfare for that investment. It's then revealed that Entergy has negotiated a deal with Meta about the energy costs associated with this facility. The energy consumption of that facility, trade secret, so nobody knows. But Entergy, later files with the commission application to build 2+ gigawatts of natural gas fired capacity. And the reason that it's filing this application, one of the reasons it's doing so, is because it wants to bypass the standard RFP process that it normally has to use when it wants to build new generation. There's some sort of competitive process it normally has to go through, but it says, no, we actually need to build this right away. So we're going to bypass the competitive process. They take the position that regulators in Louisiana have no jurisdiction over their contract with Meta. That's a side deal that is beyond the jurisdiction of the commission, but it's ultimately, eventually, due to this proceeding about building the gas-fired generators, ends up being filed, and so the parties have access to it. And what we know about that contract just comes from the parties' arguments in that proceeding. And what seems to be the case there, the industrial users opposed the deal. They were joined by environmental advocates, so an unusual coalition of sort of like these petrochemical companies and like Sierra Club on the same team here. And they basically say that the contract only covers about $2 billion of the $4 billion total costs. And Entergy is going to rate base everything, and the public is basically going to be on the hook for $2 billion here. Just a week or two ago, the Public Service Commission approved a settlement agreement that puts all that in motion, approves all that. There's a couple issues that I'll really gloss over real quickly that we talk about on the report because they have to do with sort of, they're more RTO relevant. And I know there's not, at least not currently, an RTO in New Mexico, and there's not really, as far as I'm aware, any sort of regional transmission development in New Mexico that can sort of complicate some of these issues. But I'll just real quick just highlight some of the complexities when you have federally regulated transmission rates that flow through to state regulated retail bills. But they kind of highlight a couple issues where, as I said, like, I think we need to fundamentally revisit some of our cost allocation framework. So that basic idea, I think, may be relevant in New Mexico, even if the specifics are not. So PJM, the shown here on this map, largest market in the country. One of its goals, one of its tasks is to plan regional transmission development. For years, I've been criticized for not planning enough transmission development. The past few years, we've seen dramatic increase in planned transmission investment. Data centers are a major driver. So the example here, 2023, they approve a $5.1 billion transmission plan. PJM has a FERC-approved tariff that allocates the cost among the member utilities whose service territories you see on this map. It has to meet the sort of beneficiary pays principle. That's how they allocate transmission costs at FERC. Here's the specific formula, how they do it, which is really, this is just sort of a compromise among the parties. 50% of the regional costs are allocated among the utilities based on a sort of pro rata load share basis. And then the other 50% are allocated based on a computer simulation that is supposed to allocate the benefits of the new transmission investment. Okay, that's step one of the cost allocation process. So that results, as I put here on the screen, Maryland utilities end up paying $550 million of this $5 billion plan. So about 10% gets allocated to Maryland utilities for, again, transmission expansion largely driven by data centers that are not in Maryland. And then each utility then has its own state-approved cost allocation scheme for dividing its share among residential, commercial, industrial, et cetera. So the bottom line is, if you're a residential ratepayer in Maryland, you are paying some share of these transmission costs that are being driven by data centers in other states. And that's based on this principle that, ultimately you're going to feel some benefit from this new transmission that's going to alleviate some congestion and things like that. And so you can do this calculation that's going to show some benefits. And again, that's the way we've always thought about transmission expansion. But should we think about it differently when a lot of these costs are being driven by these individual facilities, these city-sized facilities throughout the region that happen to be owned by the world's wealthiest corporations? So you know where I end up on that question. The other big issue in PJM and other regions are the market costs, right? So capacity costs, energy costs, it's supply and demand. And right now we're seeing a dramatic increase in demand because of these computing facilities in the region. That's pushing up prices. So PJM has this annual capacity auction that's designed to procure sufficient power plant capacity to meet peak demand. You see here the prices over the past decade or so from this auction. So we went from $2 billion a year to $14 billion a year, and now $16 billion. And the market monitor pictured here, ran some calculations and says, well, this cost increase from 2 to 14 is predominantly due to data center load growth, because demand is growing a lot faster than supply can come online to meet this demand growth. Prices are going up, but right now there's no way to allocate those costs to data centers. So PJM has just kicked off this proceeding, this stakeholder process. What do we do about all this? Do we require new data centers, for example, to bring their own generation so that the capacity auction is sort of insulated from the effects of demand growth due to data center? Needless to say, the large tech companies are not enthusiastic about that proposal. So we'll see what happens in PJM. And then the final issue that applies also to PJM is this co-location issue. What happens when a data center signs a contract with an existing nuclear plant, for example? The nuclear plant had been supplying the public through the market, and now the nuclear plant's going to sign a contract that's going to sell its output just to the data center. And so that's going to have ramifications for supply and demand in the market. We're going to reduce the amount of supply in the market. And there's also this question of, should the data center that's in some sense behind the meter, in other senses it's not behind the meter, there's a big debate on whether it is or it isn't, should the data center have to pay transmission costs or not? So FERC had been scheduled to issue an order about what the rules should be on this, and we're all still on the edge of our seats waiting for FERC to do so. It's been pending for some time. So where we have these RTOs, it really raises some of these additional complex cost allocation challenges, which again, I would say there is no right answer to these cost allocation challenges. But just saying, well, we've always done it this way, so let's keep doing it this way, I don't think is like it's not a satisfying answer to me. So I do think we need to rethink some of these cost allocation challenges. And a place like PJM, it's complicated because to really do this correctly, you need action at the FERC level and you need action at the state level, and ideally coordination among all of the states in the region. And that's going to be really hard to do. So what are the consequences of all this? The most immediate consequence, and I think potential long-term consequences, is everybody's paying more for electricity, and it's because of both the infrastructure costs associated with serving these new computing facilities, as well as the market impacts that I've been talking about, where we have RTOs. Another more speculative consequence, I think in most states, if not every state, utilities are a major political player, influential particularly at legislatures. And it has often been the case that large loads, industrial consumers, are often somewhat of a check on utility influence. I think particularly in rate cases, where often some of the most sort of robust participation comes from big industrial consumers who obviously care about their energy prices a lot and have incentives to provide expert witnesses, hired lawyers, et cetera. But what happens if the largest customers, these computing facilities, what if they're benefiting from special deals from the utilities? Do they then have the same sort of incentive to challenge utilities in rate cases and other proceedings, or are they allies with the utilities? And what does that do to the political dynamics of utility regulation generally? And then I think, another consequence of all this is, because we're having this conference today, because I know, your time is very valuable and it's being taken up by this issue, there's an opportunity cost to that, which that there's so many other important issues. Again, a few years ago, before I was talking about data centers, we were talking about things like grid enhancing technologies and efficient electrification and how to integrate storage. And so to all these important issues, innovative issues that I think could really benefit consumers, do we keep kicking the can down the road on all those issues because utilities have front and center put this data center load growth issue and we all feel like it needs to be addressed immediately, to the detriment of potentially other important issues. So we have some recommendations. We don't like these side deals. We think putting in place data center tariffs is better. It's more transparent. It encourages robust participation in the process. In developing these tariffs, you can change the tariffs as you get new information about data centers. So we think that's kind of the way to go, but just saying you should have a data center tariff doesn't address what I think is the real key challenge, which is cost allocation. What's the right way to allocate costs to these data centers? The utility monopolies can get in the way here. One way you simplify this cost allocation challenge is you tell data centers to go get their own generation. And oftentimes utility monopoly laws can get in the way of that. I don't know what the deal is in New Mexico, but in some states that can be a problem where everything has to flow through the utility. And once it flows through the utility, you get into some of the cost allocation challenges that I think the Nevada speakers were talking about, where yes, the the data center wants clean power, but now it's sort of that all the system resources that the utility has are now sort of being allocated through this tariff, and it becomes difficult to kind of isolate the data center from everyone else, and so you have cost causation challenges there. You can also allow the data centers, or not require them, to go off grid. We're seeing a few of these developments around the country. Data centers don't like this, but I think it's often better than imposing massive costs on everybody else. At least require them to be mostly, if not entirely, relying on their own generation. I think is again, it simplifies the cost allocation problem. We're seeing a lot of lawmaking around this. Just to highlight a couple things, Maryland, HB 1035 passed a few months ago, I think in May, and it directs the utilities to file new large load tariffs. And there's this language in the law that says the tariffs have to protect residential retail customers from financial risks. So let me just say just a couple things on this. There's a difference between risks and costs, and I alluded to this earlier. The risk is the stranded asset risk, right? That the utility says, oh, we have gigawatts of data centers coming, so we're going to build all this transmission and generation. And then for whatever reason, that load never materializes. And now the utilities spent billions of dollars, and it's going to come to you and say, we need everybody else to pay for this now. So that's the risk. And the way you minimize that risk, and what we're seeing this happen in other states like Ohio and Indiana, is you tell the utility, it's only going to be allowed to build new infrastructure if it has sort of firm commitments from data centers. And that means a long-term contract, whether it's 10 years, 15 years, whatever the number is, that's going to cover certain charges, certain costs, demand that, basically the demand charges that these new data centers would be charged. So they have to sign long-term contracts. There's stiff, penalties for exit fees, credit requirements to make sure they can't just walk away. But basically, you're locking in these data center customers to 10 years of payments that are supposed to cover some significant percentage, if not all, of these sort of costs that they're going to impose on the system. That protects them from the risks, but there's still this cost challenge, which again goes back again to cost allocation. How are you actually setting that demand charge that you're going to put in that contract? It's one thing to require the data center to sort of pay for the radial line that goes from the utility's existing system to the data center. You can require the data center to, if it's a 500 megawatt data center, utility is going to build a 500 megawatt gas plant. Okay, require it to pay for that. But what about all the system transmission upgrades that are required for all of this new infrastructure? Oftentimes that just gets paid for by the public, not by the data center. So again, there's a lot of complicated cost allocation challenges here in isolating these costs from the public. Very briefly, the Utah bill, that's interesting because it does set up a mechanism for data centers to go off grid. It allows data centers to, it says they don't have to take utility power, right? It basically weakens the utility's monopoly. And we've seen at least one announcement of a data center development that's going to be off grid to take advantage of this opportunity. Again, it's just an announcement at this point, so we'll see if it actually moves forward. There was an announcement that it's sort of like, I think it's a gigawatt size data center that had procured some sort of natural gas plant system built by Caterpillar. But again, it's an announcement. We'll see if it moves forward. But I think this is an interesting opportunity to try to really isolate these costs from consumers by providing this opportunity for data centers to go off grid. And potentially it could be a lot faster depending on the permitting requirements. And, we often require utilities to jump through a lot of hoops for consumer protection reasons. Because we want to make sure that the investments that they're making are actually needed. But if a data center is going off grid, maybe state law allows you to bypass a lot of those processes. We don't have those consumer protection issues if it's just a contract between a data center and a generation developer, for instance. And so maybe that's actually better for everyone to allow for those sorts of opportunities. One final note on this sort of risk protection issue. protecting consumers from the risks of stranded costs is clearly a good thing. One reason that utilities are on board with this is because they can take these firm contracts that they sign with data centers and use them to justify an infrastructure build out. And there was until recently a very long-standing proceeding in Ohio before the Public Utility Commission. It was almost a year and a half long proceeding initiated by AEP, one of the largest utilities in the country, that wanted a data center tariff because it was seeing enormous interest from the hyperscalers, et cetera, in coming to Columbus, Ohio. And whatever AEP had been doing before to bring these data centers online was not protecting consumers. And so they wanted to impose the sort of contract structure I mentioned earlier, long-term deal. The data centers would have to sign certain minimum charges, exit fees, credit requirements, et cetera. All that's good for consumers. But AEP's plan, as they said in their testimony, is once we have these firm commitments in hand, we're going to go to Ohio and we're going to go to PJM and we're going to build a lot of new transmission. And the way that transmission is currently paid for in PJM is it's socialized. So on the one hand, these new contracts are protecting consumers. On the other hand, they are a vehicle for a massive transmission build out that gets paid for by everyone. So there's pitfalls, mines to be avoided here everywhere. So that's the overview that the paper provides. Happy to take any questions and comments, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here today.
Well, Ari, thank you for that presentation. I had seen your presentation before and looked at your report, and I thought that your perspective and voice would be valuable to our conversation here to help balance it out. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to present to us today. I want to see if maybe Commissioner O'Connell has any questions or comments that he would like to make.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Ari. Great to see you. One thing just would add that we do have a RTO issue with SPP, the large utility on the eastern side of the state is in SPP. And then if you're interested in this kind of stuff, SPP's got a special education session of their board of directors tomorrow morning, and then a special meeting of the board of directors Thursday afternoon. And one of the reasons is to take on this high impact load at the RTO level at SPP. And that issue is just fascinating, your presentation and how relevant it is if you sit there and look at everything SPP's trying to untangle, because it's not just the high impact loads. There are integrated transmission planning processes that are ripening. There's a enormous portfolio that was approved last year. And then with what's going on in the world right now, that portfolio is more expensive than it was planned. They're getting ready to ask board approval for another transmission planning portfolio that makes last year's look maybe pedestrian and small, even though it was eye-wateringly large by historic standards. And so, yeah, all this stuff about need to build it, cost to build it, and then allocating cost to members. And then when you've allocated to members, how's it get allocate down to utility customer bills? And then the last thing that's interesting that SPP is dealing with that you touched on, and frankly, all of our presenters did today, is how this works with things like demand response, load flexibility. If you can reduce the infrastructure has to get built because you're taking advantage of flexibility, demanding flexibility up front, trying to, and then, bottom line, something that just came through from you that we also heard directly from our Nevada presenters is the importance of the accountant's perspective while we're thinking through all this stuff. So just as an aside, I was in Utah last week, and like the Utah commissioners were talking about this new law, and so it's interesting. I don't know enough about it yet, but definitely want to dig into it. But anyway, one of the desires that was expressed was let's make electricity boring again. And so the breadth of topics with the number of details that we have to get into is we're going to succeed at that too. So again, thank you for being here, Ari.
And Ari, I do have one question. You know, you're making the case that tariffs are better for transparency. And other benefits that I see are predictability and efficiency. And I'm wondering, do you have recommendations as to a state or two that we should look to if we're trying to consider tariffs for these customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the language in the Maryland bill sets out kind of the standard approach that we're now seeing in a number of states, which is again setting out this long-term contractual commitment with these facilities. But like I said, it does not avoid what I think is the heart of the problem, which is cost allocation, which is, okay, so now you've created this customer class for these large facilities. You're going to require them to have sort of 10 years of payments, and you're going to tell them, well, you have to pay, let's say, 90% of your demand charges, okay, because you think that's sufficiently protective of other ratepayers. But how do you calculate that demand charge? You calculating it the same way you've always calculated it, or is there something different that we ought to be doing if we have, say, a gigawatt scale facility and the utilities planning on building billions of dollars of infrastructure just for this one facility? Should we be using our same old cost allocation methods, or is there something new that we need to do here? So I think, again, I mentioned that Ohio proceeding where they put in place this data center rate class, which again has a lot of the same features that the Maryland law requires, but it uses the same old cost allocation methods for this data center class, and I'm just not sure that that's sufficiently protective for the public. So I don't have a good answer on cost allocation, other than I think we really need to just think differently about this problem, because these just individual facilities are imposing such enormous infrastructure demands on the system. And there's I think just to highlight one more thing on this, Commissioner O'Connell is absolutely right to raise flexibility again, because if you can add these loads without adding infrastructure somehow, which I don't know if there's any example of that in the country, but if you can do that, then you actually lower rates for everyone, right? And so that if you can hit that sweet spot, then great, bring on these data centers. They're willing to be so flexible and contribute to the fixed cost of the system. That's great, but I don't know that I think that's sort of a theory at this point more than something that's actually, we can sort of point to an example of that actually happening somewhere.
Well, once again, thank you for your presentation. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
So, the next item on our agenda today is closing remarks, and I guess this is one of those times where we often talk amongst the commissioners about how to move forward. And I was hoping, Ms. Stefans, if you could just kind of give us a quick recap, kind of high level of, where we are, the comments that we received already, and maybe we can then have a conversation after that.
Sure. So, so far the commission's gathered information from utilities and stakeholders about how many new service requests they've received, how big this large load question is to our utilities. We've asked utilities how they're processing these requests, and we've also asked utilities for an idea of what the barriers are to serving these large load customers. And we've received some recommendations on changes to commission rules to help alleviate some of the regulatory barriers. And we've held several workshops on the scope of the issue, how utilities are processing this or load forecasting for these large customers, and now tariffs. As for next steps, OGC was going to gather all this information, do some research on the recommended rule changes, and bring it to an open meeting for the commission to kind of guide OGC on what you would like us to do next in this docket. Open if it's either opening a rulemaking or issuing a statement of policy or both, or keeping this docket open to gather more information. I know we have a pending bench request asking for updates on the Economic Development Department certification process and asking utilities to keep the commission informed on when new applications are coming. So I guess all that to say is I expect this to be culminating to an agenda discussion about where we go next.
Okay. Thank you for that recap. And fortunately, Commissioner Nybert's internet was not cooperating, so we don't have him here. And so, maybe if we need to decide on kind of direction to provide, maybe we can have that discussion at another open meeting. But Commissioner O'Connell, I see you went off mute, so
I was just being ready to strike.
okay.
If you asked me a question, I wanted to not be fumbling, but
Yeah, well, I mean, I have some thoughts on these issues. I think for the we received some recommendations on an IRP rule changes. I certainly am open to looking at those. I think we received comments that were I think from most of the stakeholders that were kind of headed in the same direction. And that's one of the things that we can look at. Another recommendation was about clarifying what ordinary course of business means in our rules that implement CCNs, and the 440s and that kind of stuff. That could be something else that is relevant. I think the hard part with this workshop is that it just touches so many issues. It's very broad, and so trying to narrow the scope and figure out what actually is important and where we should focus our time and resources, that's a challenge in itself. And the conversation that we had today about special contracts and tariffs, I think that if we were to look for updated tariffs that reflect some of these large customers, it would be helpful, at least to me, to see what a working group of all stakeholders would come up with. Maybe if we first worked on kind of the minimum requirements that we would want to implement for, the financial risks, as we talked about earlier. Um, and then if we were able to develop a general idea of what the parameters should be, then the working group could go and work on a proposed tariff and associated agreements. That's one idea that I had, but there's a lot to think about here, so I'll turn it over to you, Commissioner.
yeah, no, I agree with your list, and I like the process that Erica described for moving forward. Broadly, one of the things I think is reflective of where we're at as a commission that's been trying to improve is, going through these workshop processes, and I'll also give a shout out for tomorrow with the wildfire. I think one of the things that this is helping do is sort through, this whole tariff versus special contract question, that there are things that probably should get nailed down, and there are other things that probably should be dealt with flexibly, on a as case by case basis. If to the degree that we can identify those, then that's part of this guidance, right? That future rulemaking or guidance for uh, if somebody wants to take another run at drafting legislation. I mean, there was a couple bills in the session last year. I think we're building a foundation to where we can be more substantive or proactive in our approach to legislation, which is we want to help you make your bill good public policy. So I think we are also building a foundation for that. And that Utah bill is a great example. That one is the most comprehensive that I've heard of. And it also seems to consider scenarios that don't exist yet, right? Because too often we get to where we're writing rules or laws that deal with what happened yesterday, and then they end up, not anticipating what's going to happen tomorrow, and immediately in regret land and wished you hadn't done that. So whether the Utah bill is that or not, I don't know. I'm not a proponent of it. I'm just saying that that's the kind of thing that these conversations have built us a foundation for. And then there was a sense of urgency also in that legislation just passed, looked like huge potential for large regulatory filings under the banner of economic development were coming. Reading through the utilities requests, they sure aren't saying that in a big way, right? So maybe it's not as urgent as it was, but I also think we're in better shape than we were 6 months ago when the law passed. So anyway, that's just top of mind where I think we're at. Appreciate your comment for what next steps are. There definitely are some, even if we don't have them defined. So, I know that just working with Erica, she's built this compendium that in my mind's eye looks like the old Albuquerque phone book of things this has developed. So getting that chopped back down to lanes or bite-sized chunks is probably the biggest task. Sounds like she has in front of her.
Good. It sounds like we have some internal work to do, and we'll continue to discuss how to move forward. And at some point, should have when we have a better idea, another conversation about whether we're proposing working groups or anything like that. So we'll leave that to another time. Mr. Fons, thank you for the work that you've been doing here. I do want to note that as part of a bench request, there was kind of a two-part thing, and there's another request for responses on that on October 15. And so that's one thing that's coming up in this docket. So anything else, Commissioner?
No, again, thanks to you and Erica and all the presenters. Another, I think, valuable, productive workshop, and to the folks who participated, also public comment, Q&A. I know, one of the points Ari made was how this topic is sucking a lot of oxygen out of the room. He's right. But it also implicates a lots of other things that are going on also. And so it sometimes helps just to use this as the lens to focus it, even if the progress gets made in other places. But I think this has been an example of that.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I think with that, we are adjourned. Have a good day.